What's going on, guys? And welcome back to the MCU Rewatch Review series. Today we're talking Spider-Man Homecoming, as always, with the doc is in the house. Chris Mueller. Chris, welcome back to the show. How are you?
I'm good, Grant.
At BR_doctor on the Twitter machine is what your Twitter handle is. But we're also welcoming on another very special guest. We've had a couple guests on the last couple of episodes. We're continuing that trend with another great movie, with another great guest here today. We got at Tony Mango on the Twitter machine, is the host of a million different shows, all great content. I talked to him before on my own show. It's been quite a few years. Tony, welcome to the show, my man. How are you?
I'm not doing too bad. How you guys been?
Doing well.
Good,
And
good.
when we started doing this thing a while ago, you were one of the first names I thought of, just because you are super into the Marvel and comic book stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, outside of, obviously, we have our connection when it comes to the pro wrestling side of things, and I've got Smart Guy Moment, we're all a part of Bleacher Report, but I also have another website of mine, Fanboys Anonymous, which is predominantly talking about the MCU. I mean, it's supposed to be all sorts of geek culture, but instead of being on the video game side of things or whatever, I'm like, yeah, can I just talk a little bit more about, Cap or like, Batman, not the MCU, but still same kind of thing.
That's awesome. Well, actually, on that same note, before we go any further with the Spider-Man stuff, talk about a little bit about that, that stuff specifically. You have your website, Smart Out Moment. You talked about that. I know we've discussed that before. But Fanboys Anonymous, how did that get started, and how has that been going for you?
That was just one of those things where I realized after a while, you know what, I can't just talk about pro wrestling all the time. I got to talk about the other things that I'm a big fan of. And going back to being a little kid and being a fan of pro wrestling, the only other thing that I've been as fervently a fan of has been movies for the most part. And, I could talk for days about just Terminator 2, my favorite movie of all time. And, I've been a fan of the comic book genre and all the other kind of realms that go around that for the longest time that I can remember. So, you tell me to start rambling about anything in particular, one of the main topics I can get into is just talking about something we're doing like today, like Spider-Man, my second favorite comic book character of all time. And I can go on and on about how it's ridiculous that they have the character Tiny McKeever in the bathroom scene in this. And it's like, who's Tiny McKeever? Well, I did the research because it's something that's just, in the middle of the night, you're like, let me look up some characters and let me do this. And so Fanboys became one of those outlets where I could just sort of write up a post about, the Mount Rushmore of Batman villains or do a commentary track of a movie that I really feel like watching, whether it's on the superhero spectrum or not. That's fun.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, yeah, there's so much out there, too, when it comes to comic book stuff. It's not just the Marvel stuff. There's so much, as you mentioned, to cover. I mean, it's quite like pro wrestling in the way where you never run out of topics to talk about,
No, I mean, and especially if you start branching out into other aspects of film and TV and whatever, I mean, there's just an endless supply of stuff that you can talk about. So the issue is trying to find the time to get all that stuff out there because
Yeah.
that's the one thing none of us have enough of.
Exactly. Yeah, pro wrestling is the exact same thing. There's just way too much of it out there. And there's some good stuff, there's some bad stuff, but time is the key to consume all of this stuff. But with Spider-Man specifically, what's your connection to the Spider-Man character? What makes Spider-Man, you said your second favorite comic book character, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, nothing beats Batman. That's the thing. It's just, but Spider-Man and Batman, and for, anybody who's around my age bracket and this generation that grew up with Fox Kids and all the other kind of TV shows that were around at that time, if you weren't a fan of Power Rangers and the Batman animated series and the Spider-Man animated series, the X-Men animated series, then I don't know what you were watching at that time because that stuff was just the best. So something like the Spider-Man show, the old Radioactive, Spider-Blood, like that one show, that one was just like gospel at a certain time. So, you watch enough of that, you start getting into a lot of other things, you start collecting more different types of media that you can digest this sort of character. And Spider-Man's just been one of those that I think a lot of people can identify with in a lot of different ways, whether they're just into it because it's just fun. A lot of superhero characters, they might be fun on the surface level, but you can't really get that deep into them because who's really going to read, I don't know, say like Blue Devil and be like, I know these characters from that. Like, a lot of people don't even know that that character exists. But Spider-Man, everybody can identify with at least the quirkiness of it, or the nerd getting picked on, or just the fact that he's cool and he's got a lot of awesome villains and a lot of other characters and everything. It's really one of those series that I think expands the genre in a way that's completely different from just the old-timey, not the Rygone Superman, but I can understand why some people find him a little boring. Spider-Man, he's a lot more on the fun spectrum.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of really comes across, at least in my opinion, with Homecoming, as we'll get into. With you, Chris, what are your thoughts and, connection with the character of Spider-Man coming into this one? I mean, the MCU started in 2008. Took them 9 years to make the movie. I know, obviously, Sony owns the rights to it. We had the original Spider-Man movies, 2 different, franchises before this one finally. What were your thoughts on finally getting the Spider-Man character in the MCU prior to this point?
Well, I'm a big Spider-Man fan as well, and I grew up watching those same cartoons that Tony just mentioned. So, yeah, this is a character that he's different from most superheroes, and I heard Stan Lee sum it up really well once where he said, most superheroes are somebody that a kid wants to be someday. Spider-Man is somebody that a kid can beat now. And it's because he's so much younger that young people were able to imprint themselves onto Spider-Man and pretend to be him. So he is a very interesting character in that he's much younger than the rest of the superheroes running around, especially in the early days. And as far as bringing him into the MCU, I knew it was going to happen eventually. And I was one of those people that was a little on the fence about doing a third live-action Spider-Man within, 20 years or whatever it is. So it was a little iffy, but they could not have picked a better kid to play Spider-Man than Tom Holland. So, within 5 minutes of this movie starting, I was like, oh, I'm fully on board for this. This is great.
As a massive Spider-Man fan, Tony, did you have that same skepticism about Spider-Man being rebooted for a third time coming into Homecoming?
Especially with Sony involved, because, I mean, it's dated now to a different standard, but the first one with Tobey Maguire, for the most part, it's a rock-solid movie. There's got some flaws to it, but it's great. Second one, everybody loves it. I've lost a lot of respect for it over the years. I don't think it's as good as it used to be. It doesn't hold up as much anymore. Third one, absolutely terrible. And then you get into the Amazing Spider-Man, and Andrew Garfield, he tried to do what he could with the source material. He was great. Movie itself, not great. Second one, tons of flaws in that one. And I'm like, all right, Sony, if they can get out of the mix and we could just get the MCU, they'll do fantastic. But if they're still involved, they're going to screw it up. And there's some parts of this that I do think that they kind of ruin of this movie even. But I thought, if the third time's not the charm, then clearly this character is just problematic with Sony. And thankfully with Civil War, just a few minutes into that movie alone, when they start showing him, I mean, you see the thing that pops up on the screen where it just says Queens, and people start going nuts because they're just like, we're getting Spider-Man again. And it's like, yeah, you know what? No matter what, it's still going to be fun. And like Chris said, I mean, Tom Holland is so perfect for this role that, you melt a minute into watching the character and you go, all right, he's Spider-Man. So it winds up working extremely well, thankfully. And then he carries that on throughout all the other movies in the future, too.
Yeah, he does just a phenomenal job from start to finish with this movie and with the second one as well. We obviously see him in the Infinity War or the Avengers movie, Civil War, as you mentioned, Tony. Did you see that fake post-credit scene that they put out that someone created for the Age of Ultron movie a couple of years before this that had Spider-Man in it? And did you get your hopes up that he might be in that movie?
I don't remember seeing that. What one was that?
So it was after, I mean, it's not an actual post-credit scene, but if you go on YouTube, I remember this huge buzz. It was right before Ultron came out. It was a leaked, quote-unquote, post-credit scene. It wasn't real. If you look it up, it looks like it was filmed on a movie screen. Someone edited it to make it look like it was on a movie screen. He was, like, wiping down the movie screen. Or no, there was, like, you'd have to watch it. It's from the Universal ride, I guess. They took it from the Universal ride with Spider-Man. And it looks like it's a real... It looks like it's a real thing, and everyone thought, oh, they might introduce the character in the movie. I think Marvel had just agreed to put Spider-Man in the MCU like right before that, but it was too close to put him in Avengers. It's a very quick thing. If you look it up on YouTube, it's like 30 seconds. Do you know what I'm talking about, Chris, or no?
I vaguely remember something about this, but I couldn't tell you what happened in it.
It's very quick. Like I said, if you go on YouTube and you watch it, it got me very excited thinking that he would be in the movie. He wasn't. We see him for the first time in Civil War, as Tony mentioned. Chris, I'll go back to you. Do you think, I don't want to say rush, but they obviously completely bypassed the origin story of Spider-Man. But then again, we've seen it in multiple other movies with the Amazing Spider-Man movie and the original trilogy in the early 2000s. Do you think they made the right call by not spending too much time in the origin of the character, or did you want to see that delved into more?
Yeah, I think it was the right call to not ignore, but to bypass some of that origin because of, like you said, we've already seen it a bunch of times. We know that Uncle Ben's death is a big motivating factor. And it also sort of gave them the ability to make the character not so dour. Like, even though Spider-Man is a very upbeat character for the most part, and he's quipping all the time, when you're watching a movie and the first 10 minutes or whatever is a motivating death, the movie tends to be a little darker. And by avoiding that, they allowed this movie to be very lighthearted for the first, 90% of it. So I do think that was a smart decision on their part. And it also allows them to go back later and reveal information if they want to. And if they don't have to.
Mm-hmm. And you get that small Easter egg with the Uncle Ben encryption or whatever on the suitcase in the second movie. But other than that, they never mention Uncle Ben at all. Could you have done, Tony, without seeing the killing of Uncle Ben? I honestly have not seen the Amazing Spider-Man movies. I know the characters in the movies. I think they show him getting killed in those movies, right? The first one?
Yeah, you know what? That's one of those problematic ones, though, because they went out of their way to try to do it a little different for the sake of being different and just didn't do it as well. Like, I mean, I'm not one of those purists that says you have to follow 100% to a T every little detail, but it would be weird to me if, like, for instance, like the Batman story, everybody always says, like, you didn't need to see it in Batman versus Superman. I thought that you did, and I loved the detail of, like, the pearl is falling. Now, if they wouldn't have shown that, it wouldn't have been the end of the world. But for The Amazing Spider-Man, they went out of their way to be like, well, we're not going to do the whole thing with that he shows up at the wrestling match. We're just going to have him fall down a building and see a wrestling poster for a split second. And we're not going to have a whole thing with him refusing to go after the shooter because of that. It's just going to be that he's buying milk and the guy throws him a thing of chocolate milk or something. It's like... They even go out of their way to not use the "with great power comes great responsibility" quote. I think that Martin Sheen's character, his version of Uncle Ben, says something like, when something happens and you have the power to stop it, you got to do something about it. Or what? And it's like, you couldn't have said the line. Like, so they went and out of their way to not do it for this one, but they didn't need to. I mean, Aunt May's got a necklace on with the ring on it in Civil War. So you're like, no, that's the Uncle Ben ring. Okay, she's not wearing it anymore because he's died, and you can kind of move on at that point. It's not like they ever said, like, hey, I never had an Uncle Ben in this franchise, and then that would have been, like, pretty jarring. They moved on, and, they can kind of... Time doesn't heal all wounds, but like Chris said, I mean, we don't have to have him all throughout Civil War and all throughout this movie be like, oh man, I miss Uncle Ben. Then it would be like, pretty depressing at that point.
No, I agree. I thought it was good because there was so much in the movie as it was to just rehash the same storyline, which I know you kind of have to do with the Spider-Man character. I get it. But as opposed to doing it differently, I would rather they just not do it at all and not completely ignore it, as you guys mentioned, but, allude to it and just not outright show it. If there's no Bonesaw McGraw in the scene, then I just don't want to see it recreated personally. I will always be partial to that scene. It's amazing. But back to Homecoming, you get the tie-in with Civil War at the very beginning. And actually, even before that, we got to address this. Chris and I had mentioned this before. Tony, I'll get your thoughts on this first. Does it bother you the timeline is all sorts of fucked up in this movie with the whole 8 years later bullshit? It's confusing, and just why even put the whole 8 years later shit? It just doesn't make any sense.
They could have gone out of the way to not do that and it would have been fine. Or they could have actually, if they wanted some kind of a thing to address that years had passed, they could have just said years later. Not even 8 years, just years later. And then you can fill. They had to put 8 out there to make the whole thing seem like they couldn't use a calculator or something. Like, I mean, this has a little bit of a fluctuating timeline where they've tried to cram in some movies really quickly, and they've had some that are supposed to be like Guardians 2 is like, comes out years later, but it's supposed to be a few weeks or so after the other one. And, there's some, you can kind of play around with that a little bit, but as long as you're not addressing the exact date of when something happens, then people can fill in the gaps themselves. And as long as you say years later, you're fine. 8 years makes the whole thing all messed up.
It just makes no sense because obviously we see the scene in the beginning with, Vulture with Michael Keaton's character cleaning up after the Battle of New York, which we know for a fact took place in 2012 because they've said that multiple times in other movies. And then 8 years later would be 2020 after Infinity War, which we know takes place in 2018 when the movie came. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. They could have done without it. Like you said, they went out of their way to put that in the movie. They didn't even have to include it. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't ruin the movie for me. It's just annoying. Chris, I know we've discussed this before, but what are your thoughts on the whole timeline thing and the whole 8 years later bullshit?
I mean, that's just an unforced error. It shouldn't have happened. Somebody in the process should have seen that and said, hey, this isn't right, guys. We need to do the math better.
Yeah, exactly. Did you like the tie-in to Civil War, how you kind of see the airport battle just from a different perspective and how they kind of segue from that into the introduction to the Spider-Man, Peter Parker story with this movie?
Yeah, I actually did really like that. I thought that was a funny way to start the movie, especially because it included so many other things like him and Happy on the plane and the hotel room, and then him and Tony in the car afterwards, and then you transition to the real movie with him and Tony. And I thought that was just a good storytelling device to be like, this is right after Civil War. Mm-hmm. So this is like, we know where this is in the timeline. And yeah, it definitely, it was a unique way to start the movie compared to the other MCU movies. And it kind of set the tone for, this is a teenage character and it's going to feel different from the rest of the Marvel movies because of that.
Yeah, no, I thought they did a very good job with that, kind of acknowledging where we first saw the character in the MCU and then kind of going from there, and then showing the after effects of it too. So it's not like we see him in Civil War, and they kind of build off of it from there with, Peter saying like, oh, if you need me, just let me know, and then there's nothing for a long time. So they make it realistic too, which is cool. What were your thoughts on that, Tony, the segue into Civil War?
It's such an endearing way to bring the character in, because you get to see him act like a kid. I mean, kids these days, they're constantly on at whatever social media platform that they can get to. So of course he would be recording things, and obviously he can't post it anywhere, but like, he's playing around with the voices and stuff, and you get to see more of Happy, which is always great. You get to explain the costume in a way that, I mean, they address it in Civil War, but it's, okay, remember, we're starting off with this suit. He got it from Tony. He didn't make it himself. Let's move on. And within, 10 minutes in the movie or so, you've got a fully realized Spider-Man for this movie. He's the kid that wants to be the Avengers. He has his suit. He's bored. He's already done this whole thing. It sets you the time frame, even though they didn't need the the 2 months later and all that other kind of stuff. We kind of got the implication, but they figured out a way to introduce the character that in something that was different, which I forget which number movie this is or so. This is maybe like 12 or something in the series. They had
it's like 18 or something. It's
might even be, yeah. So they had done plenty of movies at this point, and if they would have just started off with, the Spider-Man theme and gone straight into the other parts of the movie or something like that, we would have been robbed out of some of the best gags in the whole movie, like him just being like, oh, okay, the small guy's big now. Okay, let me hold on a second. Let me put the camera down and all that. Like, they referenced it, of course, later on in the movie even better too, with just, little reminders of things like if Cap wanted to put you down, he would have. And you get to see that, like, no matter what situation Peter's in, he's always Peter Parker, even at the very, very beginning of the movie where you're still establishing the character for people that didn't really watch it. Because there's
Yeah,
weird
no,
people
yeah.
out there that don't watch these movies in order. I don't understand it.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense to me either. So you're saying with the social media platforms, obviously Spider-Man's huge on YouTube in this movie. They reference that several times, and Dad's even like, "Oh, you're a Spider-Man. You're that Spider-Man guy from YouTube," which is amazing. It's so modern, you know. It's so current. So are you telling me, Tony, that maybe in the third movie, whenever that comes out, I think in 2 years or so, are we going to see Peter Parker on TikTok?
Oh, he's totally going to do that whole flossing move and all that stuff. It has to happen, right?
I'm
Is
dreading
that
it.
even dated at this point?
Yeah, right. It might be. I don't know. I don't keep up with
yes,
the...
it is.
These kids with their Fortnites and their music and
Oh man. I'll start with you, Chris, on this. Best Peter Parker. Is it Andrew Garfield's character? Is it Tobey Maguire or Tom Holland's?
The best Peter Parker specifically, that's difficult because I have a soft spot for the Tobey Maguire character, even though the third movie is trash. But I feel like as far as just channeling the character, Tom Holland probably does it the best out of the three, and part of that has to do with the fact that he was actually hired as a teenager, whereas Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield were both in their 20s when they took the role. So it was, it's a completely different feel when you have basically a kid actually playing Spider-Man. I think it was a smart casting decision to go with somebody who was that young, but also that good of an actor, because it makes the character feel just a little more real to me. Like, I don't know, seeing Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone flirting in high school, it's like, come on. You guys don't look like you're in high school anymore.
Yeah, that can definitely be a bit, there's definitely an issue with that. I totally agree. It kind of takes you out of the moment a little bit. Is it just me, or does Tom Holland in this movie, whenever he's Peter Parker, does he come across like Michael J. Fox's Marty McFly to you at all? I noticed that when I was watching it.
He totally does. Have you ever seen that that edit that somebody's done? I think it was like maybe like 4 months ago or so, where they've used that deepfake technology, and they've had Robert Downey Jr. as Doc and Tom Holland as Marty.
I think I have. That sounds familiar. Yeah. I think I may have seen it on Twitter or something, but that sounds amazing. I got to go back and check it out then.
It works scarily real.
His mannerisms, the way that he talks. Listen, I don't want to see another Back to the Future movie. It's my favorite movie of all time. I do not want to see a fourth one. No, thank you. I don't want to see a reboot, whatever. But if they were ever to do another one, Tom Holland at this point, I don't know how old he is, but he would make for the perfect Marty McFly. Like, I don't know. He screams Marty to me. It's awesome. But yeah, so my thoughts on this, and I've heard a lot of people have various opinions. I like Tom Holland's Peter Parker a lot. He's probably my favorite Peter Parker. And people I've seen that same opinion, but people have also said that Tobey Maguire had the best Spider-Man. What are your thoughts, Tony? Where does this fall for you?
Tom Holland wins both for me. Peter Parker is my Peter Parker. You know how like everybody has their own like. Some people, for instance, they think that Batman should kill. I don't. Some people think that Superman's better when he's like some tyrant, like the Injustice games, whatever it might be. For me, my Peter Parker is not that old school classic kind of Peter Parker that we got with the Sam Raimi movies, because he was more of a fan of the original version of the character, where he was very, very dorky. And you see Andrew Garfield's character, and he's skateboarding in the hallways, and he's like clearly like the hot guy in school and whatever. And you're like, I don't think that this guy gets picked on. Whereas, you know, he's really great with like quipping and everything with the Spider-Man part. So if you kind of mesh the two together, I think you get Tom Holland, where I buy that he can be quirky enough that people can pick on him, but he's not so much of a sad sack that it's weird for me to get that trigger where he becomes Spider-Man and suddenly he's able to have all this confidence. Peter Parker, to me, he needs to get picked on, but he's not so bad that he wouldn't ever have that kind of confidence. And there's moments in the Sam Raimi movies where I feel like Peter's just a little too hokey. And I don't get that from Tom Holland. I get that somebody could pick on him, but at the same time, he could be Spider-Man too. So he wins out for me.
Yeah, I think he's a great Peter Parker. As a Spider-Man, I like him a lot. There's just a lot of similarities, a lot of things to compare there between the Spider-Mans and the suits, and like you said, I guess it's all personal preference. But like you said, he does get picked on. It's not like he's getting into fights like the Tobey Maguire original movie, but he is also very relatable. Like, he seems like a cool kid, but then he goes back to his apartment in Queens and builds a Death Star Lego set with Ned. So like, it's cool. It's not like he's this super cool kid or whatever. It's awesome. What were your thoughts? I didn't write this down originally. I just remembered that when you were talking about like the bullying and stuff like that with Flash. Now, I'm not overly familiar with the Flash character. I don't know. I don't think he's. No, I'm thinking of Venom. I'm completely off here. What were your thoughts on the Flash Thompson character, Tony? I'll start with you.
Tony Revolori is a great actor, but this is not Flash Thompson. Flash is the type of character that in my mind, he should be a physical threat and a bully. And he bullies him in this movie and calls him Penis Parker and whatever. But I get the feeling that he's just some spoiled rich kid snob and not the type of character that's actually making Peter feel like he's getting bullied. To me, the version, even though, of course, like the ages are weird, kind of like that scene in a Scary Movie where they're addressing that they're all 30 years old and playing high school characters. What's his name from How I Met Your Mother? Who's in the first movie? God, I'm blanking on his name. Joe Manganiello. He is a better Flash because he's towering over Peter, and he tries to actually punch Peter. And the kid in the second one, like Chris Zilka, I think is the actor's name or so. I get that he's more a Flash than anybody else. I can see him becoming the military guy that he comes in the comics, and the guy that actually grows to respect both Peter and Spider-Man. With this one, this isn't Flash to me, and that's something that's a problem with a lot of this. It's one of the only problems with this movie is characters have the names of characters, but they don't act like the characters for maybe a good 10 or so different people in this movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's odd. I'm not a big fan of his character. We got to see more of him in Far From Home. Is Flash supposed to go on to become someone? I thought I remember hearing that at some point.
Yeah, he becomes Agent Venom in the comics, which that might be where you're getting a little bit of the stuff mixed up. It's maybe,
yeah.
I mean, they gave it to Eddie Brock, they gave it to Matt Gargan, so we actually we had two different Venoms in this movie, but yeah, he becomes like the military version of that, where I think he's missing like a leg or maybe both legs actually.
Oh God!
And the Venom suit gives him the ability to do that or whatever, but I can't see that happening in this future. I can't see Tony Revolori suddenly becoming some wards general or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. So when I saw the movie, he doesn't scream oh, he's going to be the next villain in an upcoming Spider-Man movie. He just comes across like a twerp, I don't know. He's a good character, but yeah, I could see why it'd be disappointing. You agree with that, Chris, with Tony's thoughts on Flash?
Oh, 100%. Flash Thompson in the comics is 1,000% different, and Tony Revolori is great. He is funny in this movie, and I heard the director talk about his decision to change the Flash Thompson character, and I sort of understood where he was coming from, because he's like, today's teenagers don't deal with the same kind of bullies that we dealt with in the 80s and 90s. The bullies these days are the rich snobs and not so much just the jocks. And so I understood it from that point, but you can also make Flash a rich snob and be the physically imposing bully that he's supposed to be. Because if there's any plans to use the character in the future in the way that he is in the comics, you can't use Tony Revolori because it's just not going to work. Mm-hmm. So I do feel like they sort of went in a direction that I wouldn't have gone in. But again, we've already seen two versions of the Flash character that were kind of similar. So I admire them for taking a shot. I just don't think it's one of the few things in the movie that just didn't work. I mean, they could have just given him a different name and made him a different bully, and it would have been fine.
Mm-hmm. Was Liz Allan's character in the comics as well, or was that someone they made up for the movie?
Here's where we get into one of those problems. So she is nothing like Liz in the comics. And admittedly, Liz in the comics is a pretty vapid, boring character in some ways. They kind of originally they made her. If maybe my wires are crossed a little bit if anybody's done the actual research of reading the old school comics in like the 60s or so. But originally Liz was just sort of the go-to popular hot girl that Peter crushed on. This is like well before Mary Jane was a character, well before they even established Gwen, I think. And she was just sort of the popular cheerleader type. And eventually they sort of, I don't know, they kind of like they shoehorn certain people into different roles or they just naturally fit in that. Like, I mean, Gwen tends to be sort of the smarter version of the people that he's going after. And Mary Jane, we'll get into that. You know, like there's certain things and, you know, like Chris, for instance, you watched the old school animated series where they did a lot with Deborah Whitman, and she was kind of a little bit of like a Gwen, and they had this whole thing with Empire State University and everything like that. And Liz, I tend to think Liz is more of a bitchy character. And for some reason with this one, this is one of those things with Sony. Originally, they wanted the fourth Sam Raimi movie to be revolving around the Vulture. Mm-hmm. And it was supposed to be John Malkovich was going to play him. Somehow, they also thought, let's incorporate Black Cat into the movie, but instead of her being Black Cat, she'll be the Vulture's daughter, and she'll be Vulturess. They just created this character or whatever.
The hell?
Yeah, and it was supposed to be, I think Anne Hathaway was supposed to play the character, which this would have been a mess. And they have this issue with Sony where when they think of an idea, they refuse to adjust it. We've seen how many years now that they've been saying they want to do a Sinister Six movie, even though it can't possibly work. And that they wanted to do spin-off movies for Aunt May and Madam Web. And who in the hell has ever heard of Jackpot? And they want to do a movie based off of Jackpot. So I feel like they had this theme that they wanted to take Vulture and give him a daughter and make that a part of a movie, and they refused to budge on it. So they just decided, well, let's put Liz in there. Let's call her Liz. She's not even Liz Allan. She's Liz Toombs, because you have to change that around. And then let's make her nothing like Liz and make her Vulture's daughter, just because they wanted to do Vulture has a daughter. And it's just... It's one of those examples where they took a character, Jason Iannello and Betty Brant, they're on the TV for this, and that's not Jason Iannello and Betty Brant. They kind of like wasted these kind of names, and they could have gone with other people, like the girl on the TV. They could have gone with Indira from the MTV show. She was in the AV Club. Why wouldn't she be a part of that? And if you're going to give Vulture a daughter, give her any other name. Don't give her the name of a character that's in the comics that she doesn't act anything like.
Do you think they did that just to serve as filler before they got to MJ for the next movie? I mean, she was in this movie, but not obviously in a prominent role.
She's not in this movie either.
So with MJ, there's been a lot of mixed opinions on this. I honestly, so I'm not into the comics as much, so that's why a lot of that I first of all didn't know. So that's news to me. From a movie standpoint, I enjoyed it, but when you lay it out like that, Tony, now I feel bad for actually liking the big reveal that what's his name, Toombs, that the Vulture is Liz's dad. I'm like, oh, that's a cool twist. But then when you lay it out like that, I'm like, well, that's actually really dumb. So this is why I invite you guys on the show, because I knew nothing about this shit. I learn new stuff every time I talk to Chris about this stuff, and now you, Tony, about Spider-Man. So with MJ, what are your thoughts with the MJ character? Do you think... What are your thoughts before I go any further?
If you're going to explain to somebody who's never seen a Spider-Man show or read a comic or watched any of the movies before this, if you're going to say Harry Osborn, you're going to explain the character as he's a rich friend of Peter Parker's. He eventually becomes one of the goblins. You might call him Hobgoblin, you might call him Green Goblin. It kind of depends, whatever. But the essential point is Harry is the not as smart rich friend of Peter Parker. And if you explain Aunt May, she's the loving aunt who is always there for Peter. Sometimes she doesn't know that he's whatever, you know. There's a lot of things that are just like, you follow a couple character traits for each thing. If you explain Mary Jane, you explain, for the most part, a bombastic supermodel redhead who is popular and is the type of person who brings Peter out of his shell and is lovable, and sometimes they've tried to make her a little bit more on like I think like the game that came out recently, she's like a photographer or something instead of Peter. Like they kind of play around with it like that, but never has there ever been that she's this depressed emo goth girl who wants to do some light protesting and is just so insufferable and named Michelle Jones. Why are you not even naming the character that? Like, if you take the character and you give her a different name and you give her a different personality and you give her a different look, she's not the same character. By that rationality, we could take, for the Batman series, we could take Alfred and say, all right, Alfred is no longer named Alfred Pennyworth. He's not the butler. He's not old. He's now a little kid that hangs out at Wayne Enterprises and, is a janitor. Okay, well then he's not Alfred.
Yeah.
Like, it's just they could have had this. I don't know much about the character, but there's a Michelle Gonzalez in the comics.
Mm-hmm.
Call her Michelle Gonzalez and just have her be that character.
Yeah, it sounds like she's MJ just the name only, because they wanted that big reveal like, oh, we know MJ, so that's MJ, but it's obviously nothing like the character that we know. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not overly familiar with the comics, but even from the original movie, with the role that MJ plays in the original Spider-Man movies in the early 2000s, that's obviously more of an MJ than Zendaya is. But I thought she's very good in the role. But I could definitely see the criticism, though. Are you on the same boat as Tony, Chris, when it comes to the MJ criticisms and just not being a fan of the character being portrayed that it has been so far?
It was a weird choice for sure. I was hoping the whole movie that Zendaya's character would not be revealed to be MJ, because I did want it to be a unique character. And when you cast somebody like Zendaya, who, even though I wouldn't call her an A-list actor yet, she is one of those like young people who's on the radar for a lot of people because of her Nickelodeon or Disney, whatever it was, success. So you're instantly putting a familiar face on a character that you're changing 100%, like Tony said. So I felt like that was unnecessary pressure on her as an actress. And I really wish that they would have either given her just a different name and a different identity and made her somebody completely new and unique instead of somebody who had to live up to all these previous expectations. Because when you have a character who's that well known and that beloved come in and you just completely change her, and I'm not even talking about race. I don't care that they cast a black girl as MJ because she's pretty. MJ's pretty. That's really all you need. But you put a girl in there who is taking over the role from two actresses people love. Kirsten Dunst is great. Emma Stone's great. So it just felt like Sony basically stuck Zendaya in a corner, and even though she did a good job, like all that online criticism that was levied against her wasn't fair because it should have been against Sony, not Zendaya. But yeah, it didn't feel like the MJ character. But again, the fact that she's not Mary Jane Watson does mean we could still technically get a Mary Jane Watson at some point. So maybe we have a heel turn coming for Zendaya and she becomes a villain who's somebody totally different down the line. I would hope.
Maybe.
How crazy would that be if in the future he's dating somebody else and he's like, hey, MJ, oh, I'm sorry, that's my ex.
Right.
What if, do you think they could always, I mean, not that they will, but do you think they could fix this with a multiverse type thing where they bring back Kirsten Dunst as the original MJ from the original movies?
I mean, I would love
the cradle type stuff at this point.
Well, she would still be with Tobey Maguire, though, of course. Like, I would love it if they did a multiverse thing like the Into the Spider-Verse, where we actually do get to see all the live-action Spider-Man interact for just a moment. Yep. I think that would be cool. But, again, it's wishful thinking. I mean, Sony made a great animated Spider-Man movie, but it's because they kind of just gave creative control to the people in charge and said, we're not going to really mess with anything this time. And that's what yielded a great product. So if they can keep giving filmmakers that kind of freedom then hopefully we do get some kind of interesting Spider-Man story in the future with all of them together. I'd love to see Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man get a little redemption, because he's not a bad actor. He was just given bad scripts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that would be sick. I think there's enough demand for some sort of Spider-Man reunion. Whether, I mean, Doctor Strange just sounds strange, but maybe like the next Spider-Man, the third one or whatever. Hopefully the MCU continues to involve him. I know the contract thing ran out about a year ago. They signed him on for, I think, 2 more movies, Spider-Man 3 and then a big team-up movie. So hopefully he continues to appear beyond that. Kind of on that same note, Chris, I'll start with you on this. Do you think the movie, Homecoming, had too much Marvel MCU influence with as much as we see Tony Stark and Iron Man? Do you think he kind of overshadows Peter Parker in any way?
I don't think he overshadows him in his own movie. I don't necessarily think they needed Iron Man to be there that much, but having that mentor was good because it showed that Peter wasn't just a great crime fighter right out of the gate.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to have somebody, kind of give him a few life lessons along the way was smart. And obviously that probably would have been the Uncle Ben character before he died, was passing on those nuggets of information. So it did feel like this movie was maybe spending a little too much time servicing the overall MCU instead of just being Spider-Man's origin. But at the same time, that's where we are in this series now. I mean, the MCU is a television series made up of movies at this point. We're not going to get separate stories that aren't connected anymore. It's all going to be part of the MCU going forward. So, I expect that kind of stuff out of these movies, but I would have liked it to focus a little bit more just on Spider-Man's journey and not need Iron Man to come in and save the day a couple times. But, it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, in a way it does work because obviously it builds to the big moment between the two in Infinity War and then later Endgame with Tony dying and then Peter, whatever.
Sure.
So it does pay off in the end. And I do like, as we were talking about previously in our Guardians review, how it's not paid off immediately. It's not by the end of the movie, he's like, oh, you're basically like a son to me. And he's like, I love you, Peter. Like, we don't see that dumb shit. Like, he's obviously still, it's Tony being Tony. And they still have that type of relationship that we see in the beginning where it's like, I love that part where he's opening the door for him, but Peter thinks he's giving him a hug. That's a great way to like show that Tony, they're not quite on that level yet. They ended up getting there by the end of Endgame, but I thought that was great. So in a way it works. In a way he's in it a little too much. And what were your thoughts, Tony? Did you like it or did you not like it?
I loved it. I mean, it's a different way to tell a Spider-Man story because, like we were talking about with Into the Spider-Verse, that's an Elseworlds or a What If type of thing. So you can do whatever you want because it's not in its own universe to kind of follow its own rules. So when you incorporate something like Peter Parker swinging through New York, I mean, the Avengers Tower is going to be there. We don't know what's going to be Oscorp or Baxter Building in the future or something like that. But the little detail like that is something that actually means something to a series beyond even Spider-Man. And there's a lot of little things in this movie that they put in there to make sure that it's part of the MCU instead of just its own separate thing. Like Bruce Banner's picture in the school where he would be like an Einstein or a Hawking type that people would research. And the principal is related to one of the Howling Commandos. He's played by the same guy. The teacher is likely the same guy from is it Culver University that Bruce Banner gives the pizza to in order to get the lab?
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah. Chris mentioned that previously. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Having those kind of moments like that just make you go, yeah, this is actually a part of that. And for the first time, we have a Spider-Man that's not the only character in that series that it has powers and whatever. So we get to see him be a little bit more, not like not bad at the role, but like he's not polished. And you can have an Iron Man that says to him, like the boat scene, like if there would have been a problem, the adults are handling it and whatever. Normally in a regular Spider-Man movie, if he's the only superhero, he has to be the one that steps up all the time. He can't really fail as much. So they didn't go overboard with Tony, and they did enough that they set things up for the future and everything that I don't think that he stole the show. in a way that would have been, if it would have been like the Iron Man movie co-featuring Spider-Man, it would have been a problem. But I didn't get that feeling from it. I thought it was great.
Back to the Liz thing real quick. One thing that I didn't really come to the conclusion on until I rewatched it, just recently. Maybe I'm completely off on this, but with Liz's character, she doesn't really give Peter the time of day at all. And maybe this is supposed to be obvious, and I'm just an idiot, and I didn't figure it out until 3 years later. She doesn't give him the time of day at all until he says, or until Ned brings up that he knows Spider-Man. Is the only reason she's even really going out with him is because he knows Spider-Man, or is there a genuine interest there? Because I never really got that feeling, and I only realize that now.
I don't know if it's a matter of just sort of, let me get in with the guy who knows Spider-Man, or because it's weird. Like Laura Harrier, I think, is like 7 or so years older than Tom Holland, and she is
really
supposed to be a senior, and he's I think like a sophomore or something like that. But it feels like there's an age gap, and there's almost a part of this that makes me feel like there's not a romantic entanglement between the two. It's more of like oddly enough, like a big sister type of thing. It's really, it's not my favorite romantic side quest in one of these Spider-Man movies, that's for sure. Then again, when you get into Michelle, I don't think that they have any chemistry either, so that's a problem. There's more chemistry between Ned and Betty in the second movie than there is in Peter and anybody else in these films.
Yeah.
I love, that's a different review for a different day, but I love the relationship that Ned and Betty have in that second movie, with like her ordering him around. That's such like a classic high school like relationship that I've just seen so many times. It's amazing. But they do have great chemistry in that film, though. With the Shocker, real quick, Tony, do you think we're going to see more of the Shocker in upcoming Spider-Man movies? Because he doesn't die in this film, right?
No, they have the two Shockers. They've got the one Montana who, because there's two different people that have been Shocker in the comics, and they actually put them both in here, killed one of them off because it was just like, well, he's not the one that's the main one. The Herman Schultz one's the main one, and he doesn't die if I remember correctly. But they could play around with that if they want to do that whole Sinister Six movie or so. Shocker could be one of them, or he could just be a character that maybe pops up in some kind of little side thing. Maybe he's a part of the Thunderbolts once they get around to doing that. But he's good enough. I mean, he's one of those like C-level villains where he's the Shocker, and that's pretty much all you need to know. I mean, I love that part where he says, you're running around calling yourself the Shocker. What is this, pro wrestling? It's like, It's true, because the character is not the most intimidating in the world. He wears basically like a comforter for his outfit. It's a padded outfit and everything, but you got good enough out of the Shocker out of this movie. I don't think he really needs to return.
I forgot completely about that pro wrestling line until I recently rewatched it. I'm like, oh, that's a great line. I didn't even really realize that the first time. What about you, Chris? Do you want to see more of the Shocker in the MCU, or do you think this was it for him?
I mean, I like Bokeem Woodbine, so I don't have any problem with them bringing the Shocker back. I felt like if they were setting him up to be a bigger villain later on, they failed a little bit. Mm-hmm. If they just wanted him to be a C-list villain, then he played that role well. But yeah, I mean, he is one of those characters that didn't die. Like, he just got slammed into a bus at the end, right?
I think so. Yeah, he was. I don't even think we see him get arrested either. I think he just gets slammed into a bus and that's it.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what they do in the future, if they try to do a Sinister Six thing, or if they decide that maybe that's not a good idea for live action, because they tried to set that up in Amazing Spider-Man 2, and then there was never anything followed up with it, so they couldn't do it again. But yeah, it was cool to see Bokeem Woodbine get a chance to kind of be funny in a couple of scenes, because he is a funny actor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no,
so I liked his inclusion, and I didn't feel like it made the movie overstuffed with villains, because he wasn't supposed to be the main villain. He was just sort of Adrian Toomes' henchman, so he played that role well.
Yeah, no, I thought he played his role well as well. With Adrian Toomes, this was one of my favorite parts of the entire movie. I mean, we could talk all day about the Liz and the MJ stuff. I thought Michael Keaton's performance as Adrian Toomes as the Vulture was great. I thought he was one of the best parts of this entire movie. Again, you guys can talk more about the comic connection there when it comes to the Vulture and if they did the character justice. And Chris, I'll start out with you on that. But what were your thoughts on the Vulture character, and then specifically Michael Keaton being casted as Adrian Toomes / the Vulture in this movie?
Well, as somebody who grew up with the Michael Keaton Batman movies, as like those were the definitive portrayal of Batman at the time, I was very happy to see Michael Keaton not only return to superhero stuff, but to take the role of a villain. That made me very happy. I don't know a ton about the character from the comics, so I can't speak as to how accurate the portrayal was, but I do feel like he was a well-built villain who it was smart not to kill him because he can come back bigger and stronger later on if that's the plan. And it seems like they had a scene in, what was it, the Morbius trailer where he showed up, right?
Yes, correct, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of curious to see what happens with him if that actually like takes him out of the MCU and he just does the Sony Marvel stuff, or if he's going to be in any of the MCU movies in the future. I'm very interested to see what they do with him going forward.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad they didn't kill him off. And I think my favorite part about Toomes in this movie is that he's a very redeemable character. Because obviously the first thing that we see in this film is him getting laid off from the job of cleaning up the Battle of New York back in 2012 or whenever this is supposed to be, 8 years earlier before this movie takes place. But he's doing it for his family. Like, he's not doing it because he's this evil superhero. He's doing it to make a living. And then we see him at the end, and he kind of saves Spider-Man's ass by not giving away his identity in jail to the Scorpion guy. So I thought his performance was great. I thought the motivations were great. Some of the best heels in wrestling have a reason for what they're doing, have like sound logic. And we kind of see that here with the Adrian Toomes character, I thought. What about you, Tony? What were your thoughts on the Adrian Toomes character portrayed by Michael Keaton?
Oh, he's fantastic. He's one of the best villains that they've had in the entire MCU, I think. And
I agree.
There's a couple of different variations that they've had over the years, and some even multiple different people have been Vulture. I think Blackie Drago is the name of one of the other ones. So they've kind of done their own thing in some ways, and they've kind of pulled from some of those old source material things too. Like, they didn't need to do the whole thing with stealing somebody's age for this to be like accurate or whatever. But it's weird that he goes from Batman to Birdman to a Birdman another way with Vulture, and he pulls it off so well to the point that in the scene with Damage Control, which it's a shame that they didn't explore that more because that's fantastic that they did that, but they introduce him in a way that you are on his side in the first scene of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And within a minute or so, you go, okay, well, now he's a bad guy, and I have to root against him. But throughout the whole film, you see these little other villains sprinkled in, two different shockers. Scorpion is just an evil person in this movie. Tinkerer is admittedly not like the most intimidating, but he's the one messing around with things for the sake of being a bad guy. And the only two people that have redeemable qualities to them are Aaron Davis, which we can talk about a little bit, I'm sure, in the future, but he and Vulture. And for them to take a character that didn't need to be redeemable, because he doesn't have to be redeemable in the comics and stuff even, and to make him somebody who you actually kind of are rooting for at the end, that he doesn't die like many of the other Spider-Man villains do, like, Doc Ock sacrifices himself and everything. To bring him back in the future is going to be great, because whatever fashion they bring him in, Michael Keaton's awesome. So,
yeah,
he did a fantastic job. The character looks great with the way that they had that jacket just be a little bit of like that Vulture-ish kind of the neckline to it and everything. It's a fantastic way to do it, and I can only imagine how bad the Sam Raimi one would have been in comparison to that.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
John Malkovich walking around with like a skin tight Vulture suit, probably, or like everybody always says like it's like a Power Ranger version of the Green Goblin thing. God, that would have been awful.
That's terrible.
But it also kind of probably would have been hilarious at the same time.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, there is something intentionally or unintentionally funny about the third Spider-Man movie. Like, I read something recently. It's one of those dumb fan theories that'll never get proven, but somebody pointed out, like, what if Peter Parker knows he's in a movie and that's why he's hamming it up the entire time? So if you watch Spider-Man 3 and you go into it with the context of Peter Parker knows he's in a movie, everything changes, and like all his little winks to the camera all of a sudden make sense. and him dancing like an idiot on the street and all the girls looking at him like, what is this guy doing? Like, it all that is given better context if you watch it with that.
If you treat Spider-Man 3 as Deadpool prequel.
Basically, yes. Like, if you look at it as Spider-Man has that knowledge and breaks the fourth wall, because he looks directly in the camera like 3 times in that movie. And, like, one of them, I think he even winks at the camera.
Yeah.
And it's like, come on. I mean, I get it that Sam Raimi is that kind of filmmaker. He's just a little off, and that's what makes his movies so interesting. But that movie felt like a combination of all his weirdness and like 10 million studio notes.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say, just I had read something similar, Chris, that I guess the character doing that dumb stuff on the street, he was intending to be cringy, like not Tobey Maguire, but like Peter was doing that on purpose. I don't know. I forgot what the theory was, but it was something similar to that, where they were kind of giving Sam Raimi too much credit, where I think they were just going for something completely different, and it just did not work at all. But I guess if you look at it like that, then it kind of redeems the movies. But it is unintentionally funny, absolutely.
Imagine if Sam Raimi literally thinks that that's what a cool guy looks like. He's just right. Why is everybody laughing? This would be great. I would think that this guy's the coolest guy in the world if he had that haircut and everything.
Well, with Sam Raimi,
I don't know how much you guys know about him, but like if you watch some interviews with him or read some stuff that he's written, like the 70s informs so much of who that guy is.
Oh, yeah.
And if you watch some movies from the 70s, there are dudes walking down the street dancing. That was a thing. So the fact that he put that in the movie, like so many people look at that and they're like, oh, that's so dumb. And I kind of look at it like, Sam Raimi's just doing whatever he wants. All right, gotta give it up. Like
his first choice for the role of Peter Parker would have been John Travolta back from Saturday Night Fever.
Oh my God.
That makes
pudgiest Spider-Man ever.
That makes a lot more sense now that you mentioned. That probably has something to do with it. So yeah, I'll actually have to go back and watch the movie with that in mind, because that might make more sense than it does already.
Like if you watch it as a comedy, it's brilliant.
It's amazing. Yeah.
If you watch it as a superhero movie, Spider-Man 3 falls apart in the first 5 minutes.
Yeah. Thankfully.
And let's not even talk about how poorly they used Gwen Stacy in that movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's like
but that's kind of indicative of what this movie is like, though. I mean, they gave her the Gwen name, and she's not really Gwen, whereas like the characters like in this one, like we talked about Michelle Jones being Mary Jane, they were just like, that's a name from the comics, that person's this one, and you're like, well, now you can't ever use that. Like,
was Gwen in this movie?
Gwen was possibly in this movie. There's background characters that they gave names to that they just sort of gave a name to, like one of the girls on the bus in Infinity War, they just named Cindy, and that's the character Silk from the comics. They're just like, that's her. And I mentioned like Tiny McKeever, and like he's just the kid that washes his hands in the bathroom scene, and it's like, well, now you can't ever use that character for this or that character for that. So I know that there were some reports that one of the background girls in one of the scenes was Gwen, and it wouldn't shock me if they were like just telling people, you're playing this character and you're this person and all that. And if that's a shame that they wrote that kind of thing.
I actually know what you're talking about with that report. There's a girl who has the short blonde hair and a very similar outfit to what you see in Into the Spider-Verse, but I think people made that connection when it wasn't meant to be made. Because I don't think they made the Into the Spider-Verse movie and this character like, oh, let's take the look from that movie and put it in here, because Into the Spider-Verse wasn't even like released yet. So I think some people made that connection when it wasn't supposed to be. But if Gwen was already in the movie, it wouldn't shock me. I just didn't think there was a named character that was supposed to be her.
They never, at least in the movie, say like, hey, Gwen Stacy, come over here and like sign this paper or anything like that.
Yeah.
I mean, they've retconned things in the past, that Iron Man 2 scene with the little kid, and then they were like, hey, that's Peter. Like that never was supposed to be Peter Parker in the past.
Literally just did that because
he called Kevin Feige and was like, "Hey, this is funny. I like this idea. Can we do it?" And Kevin's like, "Yeah, whatever."
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change anything. Sure, you're the kid in Iron Man 2.
And
Go make a movie for me, Tom.
They don't even acknowledge that in the MCU, right? That's more of an off-screen thing that they say that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they could even change that again in the future and just say, never mind, we were joking. Kind of like what they did with the whole, the Mandarin, where they do an entire movie and then they go, never mind, now we know that you hated us. And
yeah, exactly.
Jesus, that's dumb. Well, one positive thing I did like about the movie that you mentioned earlier, Tony, that I did want to discuss a bit more, Aaron Davis's cameo. I thought that was great. A lot of speculation that this could somehow tie in to the Into the Spider-Verse movie. He mentioned that he had a nephew. I don't think it's in the movie, but it's a deleted scene. I don't know if that's still canon or not. I'm sure it is. We don't see Donald Glover's character in Far From Home. But what were your thoughts on the inclusion of that character and what you want to see from maybe an MCU Miles Davis in the MCU?
I'm not the biggest Miles fan. Like, to me, the people that kind of champion the idea that Miles should be the one and only Spider-Man, I'm like, but you're missing all of what makes Peter Parker such a fun character. Like, it's more than just the mask that turns that into that. I love the idea of Miles being like a protege and kind of almost like a Robin to Peter Parker's Batman. So including Aaron Davis in there and having him mention, because he does mention, I've got a nephew that lives around here in the scene where he's doing interrogation mode and all that. And they reference the thing with when he's originally looking for the weaponry, and the only thing he's interested in is when they say, we've got climbers, which is like, his character climbs and stuff, so that's good. But even just including Donald Glover in any capacity is great, because that was such a good connection to all the ideas that he could potentially be a Peter Parker if he would have been young enough. And they reference that in Community, which is great. And then, of course, they reference the Community reference and Into the Spider-Verse, which now you're circling and kind of stacking up on top of each other with all these references. But, it's the type of thing where that's one of the few instances where they took a character and they gave it just enough of the characterization and the name, and they kept things the way that it should, that they did it well enough that it was justifiable that character is that character. They could have incorporated 1,000 different characters that are no-name things from the comics and stuff. And I mean, I don't even know. Like, they probably at some point in the comics mentioned that he's got a phys ed teacher named such and such, and they could have made that character that says Captain America's a war criminal, like that kind of thing. But which is great. I love that. We got to talk about that though.
That's so fun. Go into that when you're done.
Like, when you name the characters certain characters and you take just a name and you slap it on to nothing, that is awful. But when you can use a character from the comics, I always feel like a lot of these movies, they don't take advantage of that as much as they can. And here's like an off-ball reference, but like from Age of Ultron, the doctor that's been working with them, and she uses the whole she helps create Vision.
Ellen Cho.
They never really said yet whether or not she is going to have a son, but if her son grows up to be the character in the comics, then that's a great reference to that, for instance. And when they
talking about Amadeus, right?
Right, Amadeus Cho. And they gave the character that is in Incredible Hulk and plays the teacher in this one, they named him Amadeus Cho in one of the novelizations, and it's like, that's not Amadeus Cho. So it's really weird.
Asian.
Yeah, that's the kind of weird things that happens. And something like this, when you've got a character that can be the uncle of Miles Morales, and he's a criminal who is looking for weaponry, and he's around that age bracket, that would work out well, and all this. Going with the Aaron Davis character is perfect for that. And if anybody is interested in knowing more about that character, they start looking into the comics, they start doing this. Eventually, they become fans of the Miles character. So that's great. And I think that was one of those neat little touches that they put in there that makes me wonder if there's multiple writers on this movie that, like, one of them understood how to do those things, and the other one's like, I want Washington Monument. That's it. I just want that in the movie. And, like, you know.
Right. Yeah, so, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
I can actually speak to that. I'm pretty sure that that's a John Francis Daly thing. John Francis Daley is one of the many screenwriters on this movie, but he's also just an accomplished screenwriter on his own. And he's also an actor who a lot of people know from Freaks and Geeks.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of the few writers that they actually sent out to do the press junkets for this movie. And it seemed like he was the one who was championing all these little Easter eggs and cameos, and because he's such a comic book nerd in his own life. So yeah, I'm pretty sure John Francis Daley was the one who's like, we need to put in this, we need to put in this, we need to put in this. I just want to throw my whole toy box into this movie. Like, because it's like when you give a nerd the chance to write a movie about a character he probably grew up idolizing, it's going to end up having some details in it that the average non-fan might not pick up on, that are just for the people who know that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think overall, some of the minor characters, even though they're only in name only, as you know, Tony was talking about earlier, I think they did a very good job with that. I don't know the name of the actor, and you guys can help me out here. He's the guy that plays the gym teacher here, and he's in Daddy's Home too. What's that guy's name?
Hannibal Buress.
Hannibal Buress. I love, again, we don't see much of him at all, but I love that scene that Tony mentioned where they show the Captain America video. And I feel like after I watched it back, it sounds like they dubbed it over with something else, because they don't show him for the full, when he goes, oh, I'm pretty sure this guy's a war criminal now, but whatever. They cut away when he says war criminal and then whatever. He does say Captain America, but they cut away with the war criminal stuff. So I don't know if they changed that or they went with something different. I know this came out after Civil War. I don't know if they recorded it or filmed it before. I don't know. Maybe I'm just overanalyzing it. But I love that scene too. I thought he was. I would love to see more of that teacher in another movie. He's not in the second one. I love the what's his name? The guy from Hulk that Tony you mentioned, the teacher. What's his name?
I forget the character's name in the movie. It's just like, Mr. Such and Such or whatever. But
yeah.
Mr. Harrington. Martin Starr is the actor. Mr. Harrington was all they ever called him.
Mr. Harrington, right. Yeah, I loved his role too. I loved after when they show the news report after the kids get saved by Spider-Man in the monument. He goes, "We can't afford to leave. We can't afford to lose any kids on another school trip. Not again," or something like that. I thought that was great too. And then they zoom in on his face.
Martin Starr is a hilarious actor, and I'm so happy that they brought him in and that they decided to actually make him like the same character from the Hulk.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I have a feeling that was an improv, because Tom Holland talked about how Martin Starr made him laugh like uncontrollably several times.
Oh, really? That's great. He's even
pair
funnier.
Him up with J.B. Smoove in the second movie, and it's like, you have these two accomplished comedians. They're probably just making the entire cast laugh the entire time.
I know, that was great. That was one of the highlights of that movie too, was the chemistry that they had. Final few things as we wrap up here. I know your favorite, Chris, your all-time favorite character in the MCU. We get Pepper Potts back. Gwyneth Paltrow, a favorite of yours, Chris. What were your thoughts on her return at the end of the movie? Was it forced? Was it a nice surprise? We hadn't seen her since Iron Man 3. So, and we talked about in another review that she didn't know she was in the movie. Yeah, that was great too. What were your thoughts on her?
She's Tony's love interest. If you're going to have Tony in the movie, and the whole oh, well, let's cover up the announcement we were going to make with a proposal was kind of funny.
Yeah.
Because, frankly, that's not a scene you need. You don't need to see Iron Man propose to her. We've already seen multiple scenes of them confessing the way they feel about each other. So to make it a laugh, I thought was the smart thing to do.
Yeah, and
she's only 10 seconds. I mean, Gwyneth Paltrow is a good actress, so whatever.
Yeah, I liked how they referenced too that Happy's been holding on to the ring since 2008, which was great. And this came out in 2017. Again, we have no idea when this is supposed to take place timeline wise, apparently. But it was funny that they referenced that. Your thoughts, Tony, on the quick return of Pepper Potts after she was gone for a few movies? They mentioned her, but we didn't see her at least since Iron Man 3.
Little touches like that just make this so much better, because it shows you that it's a lived-in world. And I mean, even like the Captain America thing we were just talking about, like if he would have been a character in the real world, they would, of course, have, PSAs. Like, he would be kind of like how Shaquille O'Neal's running ads for Papa John's now. And, the Shaq-a-Roni thing, Captain America wearing the outfit from Avengers that was more like, over the top and whatever. Like, he would do extra little things like that as part of some kind of, government reach out thing. And you have characters that if they're interacting with people that they would be coming across, it would almost be strange to not have them reference certain things. And they didn't need to have Pepper in there. They could have gotten away with Tony just walking in and saying he'd figure something out with the press conference, and maybe even just saying, like, I'm going to meet up with Pepper or whatever like that. But to take her and get her to film one scene one day, I'm sure it didn't take that long. That's probably why she doesn't know which movie she's in, because she probably just came in and just said, I don't know, this is a pickup shot for something or whatever. But like, that kind of little detail makes it so much better. And they could have incorporated plenty of other different characters in there and just tried to play with their own toys, I guess. And to work with the MCU meant that this wasn't just a Spider-Man movie that happens to tie into the Avengers one. So this is another extension of that. And I loved that little detail.
Yeah, I like that detail too. I liked how they brought back Captain America for the the gym scene, and then obviously for the post-credit scene that a lot of people hated just because they wasted time to sit through to watch it. I thought it was funny as hell. I know Chris,
they
you
have
liked
no
it as
sense
well.
of humor.
Yeah,
yeah, that was. That's one of the best post-credit scenes in all of the Marvel movies, in my opinion, because you could tell Chris Evans was trying not to laugh as he was delivering.
Yeah. It's a great scene. And it's so true, though, because I feel like with non-Marvel movies, a lot of people will sit through the credits just to see if there's a post-credit scene for an X-Men movie or friggin' anything now. Literally anything. Star Wars, I've seen people stay till the end to see if there's a post-credit scene. Like, what are you people doing? Like, I understand, like, some films do it, but still, it's funny that they brought that up. As we wind down here, Chris, I'll start with you. What were your final overall thoughts on Spider-Man Homecoming? Where does it fall in the MCU for you? Because I've seen people say, and we'll get to our rankings in another episode down the road, I've seen people say, oh, it's the greatest MCU movie. I don't feel that way at all. I love the movie a lot. I don't even know if it's in my top 5, but what about you, Chris?
It's definitely a top 10, probably not a top 5, but it's a great movie on its own and as part of the MCU. I know that it's got its problems, as we've talked about, with certain characters not living up to what they should be, but at the same time, it feels completely different from the other Spider-Man movies, and I think that's what I liked the most about it, was that, like, it finally felt like they got Peter Parker right. And as long as they got Peter Parker right, I didn't really care if they changed too much around him, as long as his portrayal, and Tom Holland did a perfect job as Peter Parker. He just gets that character, I think. So, yeah, I really liked this movie. I really hope Michael Keaton comes back. I really just think that there's so much potential with his character to be a recurring villain. And, yeah, this movie just sets up the character to continue in the MCU for a while in a good way.
I agree. It set the stage quite nicely for what we're going to be seeing and what we have seen already from the Spider-Man character in the MCU. What about you, Tony? What about you, Tony? Overall thoughts, 2 cents on Spider-Man Homecoming?
It's got some flaws to it. It's not perfect, but none of the movies are pretty perfect. I mean, it's not one of my top 5. I forget exactly which ranking I ended up giving it. It's somewhere towards the top, but it's not quite the actual top. Mm-hmm. And there's moments in this movie that are just brilliant. There's moments that are problematic. There's characters that are problematic, like Liz. There's characters like Ned who are just fantastic. I find so much of this movie to be a lot of fun that it's hard to dislike it. And this was the type of movie that if they would have done a bad job with this, it would have felt like you can't do a good Spider-Man movie at that point. The fact that they pulled it off means that they knew what character they wanted to do. They knew how they wanted to fit in that world. And I think it's hard to dislike this movie. It's one of the ones that I can pop on and watch pretty much at any time. But not my favorite. That's the strength of some of the other movies, though. That's the problem. It's not that this is, maybe it's in the top 10, probably, but that's because there's some fantastic movies that are 1 to 9 or so.
Exactly. I said this to Chris before. I said this in one of the other reviews that we did. I think with Captain Marvel, with Rob, that's actually coming out after this. Our timeline's messed up. We talk about timelines being messed up with Spider-Man. Our timeline's all messed up with our recording process in terms of what movies we talk about next. But I told, it feels like a week ago at this point, but I told Rob Rob and Chris, that with the movies in the MCU, to me it feels like the takeovers, like the NXT takeovers, they're all great shows. Some are just better than others. This might not have been TakeOver New York, but it might have been TakeOver War Games 3. Like, there's a lot of great shows, a lot of great movies. You can't go wrong with any of them. And, if it's on TV, always worth a watch. Love me some Homecoming. This has been awesome. Very happy we were able to get you on for it, Tony. Being the big Spider-Man.
I do have one thing I got to
go ahead. Go ahead, Chris.
We didn't talk about this.
Sure.
I want to know if you guys were ready for Aunt May to be hot.
She's progressively getting younger. Is she going to be like 15 years old in the next reboot 10 years from now? Jesus Christ.
I mean, Marissa Tomei, it's weird that my Aunt May is not some grandma. I never understood why they made her so much of an age gap where it's like, she should definitely not be that age with Rosemary Harris. But I thought going into the Andrew Garfield one, I'm like, Sally Field, she didn't look that bad. And I was like, oh, we actually have a good-looking Aunt May. And then they go with Marissa Tomei, and I'm like, wow, okay, that's way to upgrade even more. I mean...
Well, I love that they put in the little line about, like, how that one waiter kind of had a crush on.
Yeah.
But, yeah, Marissa Tomei... First of all, the fact that she got to do a scene with Robert Downey Jr. is hilarious because they were a couple in real life, and then he's like constantly.
Oh, I didn't know that. I had no idea about that. Holy shit!
They dated in real life. They were in a couple movies together in like the late '80s or early '90s, and then they actually dated for a while. And I don't think it was one of those tumultuous relationships that ended on bad terms, so that's why they're friendly with each other. But yeah, when he first walks into the apartment and Tony's sitting on the couch with her, I'm like, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
Anyone who knows the history of this two is going to laugh at that.
Well, with that being said, sorry, go ahead, Tony.
I was just going to toss out there another little nugget. If you're talking about people who have had relationships, it's kind of weird. The person who voices Karen, the suit, is Jennifer Connelly. And that is at least in part a reference to her husband is Paul Bettany, who does the voice of Jarvis.
Holy shit. That's
so
cool.
they did that as kind of a little wink for that. I mean, I didn't have any idea that was Jennifer Connelly during the movie because it's just a voice that's not, it's not like James Earl Jones where you're like, okay, it's clearly that, whatever. But
yeah.
So they played around with some of those little references, and that's, I don't know what the next one's going to be in the future. Maybe we're going to get Marissa Tomei as Aunt May, and she's going to be
dealing with Joe Pesci in the future or something like that.
Oh my God. All right. My Cousin Vinny is a top 10 movie for me of all time. I will watch that movie whenever it is on. I love it so much. And if they put Joe Pesci in the MCU in a scene with Marissa Tomei, I would instantly make it my number one movie. I don't care what else surrounds it.
You know what they do? I mean, the third movie, he's got to prove his innocence after being accused of being a murderer, right? Who's his lawyer?
Oh, my God. And it would be even better if it was recommended to him by Ralph Macchio somehow.
I think you guys are fantasy casting the third Spider-Man movie right now. This is perfect.
Mm-hmm. And if it ends up happening, where they stole the idea.
Exactly. Exactly. It should be great.
It's so sad that Fred Gwynn is dead because he could be a judge. Just like in My Cousin Vinny.
Well, they got 2 years to cast this stuff. I mean, they're not going to cast him because he's dead, like you said. But, Joe Pesci can still happen. If you guys get the petition started now, there's a good chance it could still happen before then.
They can do anything with CGI these days.
Yeah, that's a point.
They can bring him back.
Pesci doesn't come out to act very much these days, so it would take a lot. But I have a feeling if Marissa Tomei called him, he'd probably say okay.
Yeah, I admit, he did The Irishman, and I enjoyed The Irishman, but a cameo in the third Spider-Man movie, you pay him the right amount of money to come in for 5 minutes. I don't see why not.
As long as he gets to basically be that character, like even if it's not in the name, as long as he acts like he did in My Cousin Vinny and he's just all quick talking and funny, I'll be happy.
Yeah.
They'll get their wires crossed, and he'll show up in the movie, but he'll be the character from Home Alone instead.
Oh my gosh.
That'd be great. I mean,
him and Daniels walk in.
There's a criminals he busts in the beginning of the movie or something. Yeah, why not?
Hey, I'd love to see that.
That's it. They break it. That's it. The wet bandits break into Aunt May's house. Spider-Man foils them, and Marissa Tomei yells at him. And then she just all of a sudden slips into that ridiculous accent she had in My Cousin Vinny.
Hey, that'd be great. Hey, we got Donald Glover in the MCU, and people are petitioning him to be in a Spider-Man movie. So you never know; anything can happen.
Yeah, well, who knows? I mean, Joel McHale will probably end up in the MCU someday, so hopefully we get a Community reunion with Danny Pudi's random Hydra employee and all the other stuff. I mean, the Russos were a big part of Community for a little while, so it would not shock me at all if they kept throwing these actors a little bone. Alison Brie will be a superhero someday. I have no doubt about that, so I hope to see her with them too.
Maybe Spider-Woman. Well, that's a possibility.
Which Spider-Woman are we talking about? Jessica Drew? Because that would be great casting.
Yeah, I'm kind of hoping that that's the case. But
that would be.
I guess we'll see. I don't know. Everybody wants to be in the MCU, and I don't blame them.
No, are you kidding me, dude? Like, Glenn Close literally wanted to do Guardians because of her grandkids. Like,
that's sick.
Yeah, it's awesome.
That's awesome. Well, we got a lot of cool cameos in the MCU, and I'm hoping that we see more in the future with future installments. We got a lot of good ones in this one as well.
Yeah.
Great movie. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Graham and I are planning on maybe doing some of the older Marvel movies from before the MCU, because we're definitely going to record a Howard the Duck episode with Rob. So we'll definitely have to get you back on for some of those, Tony. This was fun.
Hey, anytime you guys want me, I had a lot of fun. So, you bring me on, I'm there.
Most definitely,
awesome.
Dude. Before we let you go, once again, where can people find you on, your websites, Twitter machine, Facebook, MySpace, Xbox Live, AIM, all that good stuff?
Oh, God, I am on way too many things. If there's a plate, I'm spinning it. So if you check me out at Smark Out Moment for the wrestling stuff, you check me out at fanboysanonymous.com for those kind of things. I'd love to do more for that. It's just a matter of timing. I am on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on all these different things. But if you go to Toe-Knee Mango, spelled out like the body parts, Toe-Knee Mango, and a mango tree, and if you start clicking on one of these sites, you're going to see links to everything all over the place. So yeah, just start clicking around, and hopefully you enjoy what you see there.
Perfect. Well, like Chris said, this has been awesome. A lot of fun, guys. Thanks so much for coming on. Chris, people can find you on the Twitter machine at BR_doctor. And we are the Bleach Report crew as well. Check out our work there for the WWE section and beyond. But this has been awesome. Thanks, guys, so much. And Chris, I'll catch you on the next one as we talk about Thor Ragnarok.